Hi, welcome to our lecture discussion, a pre recorded discussion on nutrition and adolescence part 1. This is entitled part 1 because we will be largely focusing on the normal or healthy teen. So, we'll be talking more about obesity and eating disorders and um, other topics surrounding a teenager's life related to nutrition in the succeeding lectures. So, to begin our topic outline, we'll briefly talk about the introduction on the topic and then proceed to growth and development of teens, their nutritional requirements, some eating behaviors, and these are the normal eating behaviors among teens um, of the day, and then specific nutrition counseling tips, some ideas for teens. So, as an introduction, well, if we talk about adolescence, the more formal definition or broad definition of adolescence is that period between onset of puberty and adulthood. Now, puberty is that period of life during which secondary sex characteristics develop and the ability of the individual to reproduce is attained. It is also during this time that maturation process involves not just the physical growth but also the emotional maturation, right? So it is because of these two that complex changes occur during this period of a person's life, adolescence. And these include physical changes, which can increase nutrient needs as well as calorie needs. Emotional, intellectual, and social changes makes meeting needs a challenge, which are these are basically the factors that influence the teens or the adolescents' nutritional status. So, teenagers, because of their at this point, teenagers really want to um, build on their independence. They try to be independent from their parents, from people of authority. So they tend to make their own food choices, but their food choices, um, whether they be considered bad or good, they profoundly affect the health of the individual. And not only that, social pressures also impact choices. So peer pressure, their friends, people they relate to, people they admire. So these key people are highly influential in the um, decision-making process in terms of food among teens. And alcohol is also an issue among teenagers as they begin to form bonds with friends and they experiment on new things, and as well as diet. Now, this is critical. So, to be able to understand further about the nutritional needs of teenagers, we have to go into understanding first their growth and development. So, at this point in that person's life, dramatic increase in growth rate occurs at onset of adolescence, and this can again profoundly affect every organ of the body, including the brain, which is at this point is also rapidly developing. So the this rapid development, growth and development is called growth spurt, which lasts about 2.5 years. Now, this starts about age 11, 10 to 11 for females and age 12 to 13 for males. Now, notice that this is why for some of you, you might have observed that girls tend to grow earlier, right before going to middle school, and then boys at a later stage. But generally speaking, growth spurt occurs about a year before menarche among girls, the first menstruation among girls, among females. And for males specifically, growth spurt includes the increase in lean body mass, including muscle and bone mass, um, growth, is about 8 inches in length, no? During this period, and boys will gain about 45 pounds also during this period. Now, for girls, however, the larger percentage of body weight is fat. Now, as women, young girls approach this particular stage in their life, they begin to build on more fat, and therefore the body weight is basically more on the fat weight. Girls grow about 6 inches taller during this period and gain about 35 pounds. So for both girls and boys during adolescent years, um, there is rapid growth rate, and as well as other developmental stages. And this will require very specific and oftentimes higher nutrient requirements as compared to, say, when you're older. So we now, having understood the need for increased calories and energy, let's look at how much they really need. This is the table from the Philippine Dietary Reference Intakes, PDRIs now, published by the Food and Nutrition Research Institute of the Department of Science and Technology. And you'll notice in this table, under recommended energy intakes, if you look closely at the age range of teenagers between 13 to 18, you'll notice that for both male and female teenagers, and for both categories from weight and also energy, you'll notice that the first range of 13 to 15 is about a little bit lower than the next range of 16 to 18. But if you get the average per kilogram of body weight, from compare that against calories, you will notice that the lower the first bracket, the first range of between 13 to 15, actually require more energy, kcal per kilogram. Okay, that says a lot about how the first period, the between 13 to 15, the energy needs is higher for both male and female. And then if you look at the acceptable macronutrient distribution ranges, they're basically the same. However, if you compute based on the first table's recommended energy intakes, obviously the total amount for protein, fat, and carbohydrates would be higher um, in or among those who belong to the 16 to 18 ranges, okay, or range. Now, if we look at the recommended nutrient intake, specific macronutrients from essential fatty acids, dietary fiber, among teens between age range 13 to 18, they're relatively higher. But if you notice also that the recommendations are a little bit the same or more or less the same, um, for recommendations for age range 16 to 18, and those of recommended for adults 19 to 29. Basically, this age range 16 to 18, they have practically the same recommendations for adults. Okay. Now we go to the vitamins. Again, if you look at this table and going to that specific age range of teens, um, you'll notice that most micronutrients, most vitamins, as the age range goes from 13 to 15 now to 16 to 18. The 16 to 18 recommendations are basically the same as that of adults. Okay. Um, right. Now we go to the minerals, and again, looking at the age range, I'd like you to the same observation from the previous tables, but I'd like you to focus more on calcium, um, and iron. For females, a little bit, it's significantly higher than any other um, uh, age range among females from earlier, from before this particular stage. You notice it's bracketed at 28 milligrams for iron, and basically this is because of higher needs for iron as teenage girls begin the menstruation cycles, no? Every month. And then for calcium, you notice that, please remember that calcium is at this point the highest requirement for calcium is for this particular age range, no, including the age range earlier, no, the 10 to 12, but basically 10 to 18. That's the highest ever in a person's life that um, calcium requirement is set at 1,000. Okay, we'll talk more about this in the later slides. And then we go to the average, estimated average requirements per day. Now, this is average, meaning to say this is from the National Nutrition Surveys conducted in the past, and they figured that based on the surveys conducted, these are the average intake of, and in this particular instance, as highlighted in the slide, the teenager groups, no, between 13 to 15 and 16 to 18. And notice, for instance, I asked you to remember, say, iron. Iron for females, if you look at iron for females, for, let's go specifically to 16 to 18, it's only 16.2, and the requirement as described by the, as recommended by the FNRI, should be 28. But the iron, average intake of iron among Filipino teenagers age, women, female teenagers age 16 to 18, the average intake is only 16.2. So didn't really get to the average intake, the recommended intake. If you look at calcium also, it's not even 50%, even for both male and female teenagers. The average intake is only 440, while the recommendation, if you remember earlier, we saw that the recommendation for teens, for both male and female, for calcium um, intake every day should be 1,000 milligrams. Okay. Um, so let's go specifically at the this on the discussion of these calorie and nutrient intakes. We begin with energy, and energy needs depend on the current rate of growth, gender, body composition, physical activity. So that means you have to be very specific as to at what particular point in time or in the teen's life you're looking at. So teens generally, the teenage years are generally divided into two categories: the early and the later part. The earlier part, between 13 to 15, that is where the growth rate is most rapid, while the later years of between 16 to 18, the growth rate slows down a bit. No, so that if you think about energy needs, think about growth rate. Also dependent on energy needs are dependent on gender. So males generally, or boys generally, require higher levels of energy than girls. Body composition, you'll need to think more about energy needs in terms of, for boys, because there's increase in lean muscle mass and bone mass, but particularly for muscle mass, muscle tend to use more energy as compared to fat mass. Now, fat do not really require energy because they do not move, as compared to muscle groups. So that also that talks about body composition. So the higher the percentage of lean mass against fat mass, the higher the energy needs of the individual, particularly for teens. And then we also have to consider physical activity, as some teens are more physically active than others. Talking about contemporary lifestyles, no, some like to just chill around Netflix and being a couch potato, while others um, are more fun of going out and exercising, um, other sports activities. Okay, so the energy requirement among boys are especially high. Basically, the 15-year-old on average requires about 3,500, and this is probably a little bit higher than that of FNRI's recommendation. This is from the American recommendation to be able to maintain a normal weight. For girls, the energy needs peak sooner and so therefore decline earlier than males. So you'll notice earlier that growth spurt among teenage girls begin earlier than in boys, and they happen about a year before men are. And so therefore, what we'd be talking about here is that inactive 15-year-olds may have fewer than 1,800 calories, as girls tend to develop or gain more fat mass than muscle mass. Right. So earlier we talked about some um, nutrients that we'd like to focus on, and these are calcium and iron. And the first one I'd like to talk to you about is vitamin D. As vitamin D um, are commonly seen among teenagers, vitamin D is not something that they take in recommended amounts. Now, this is critical as vitamin D allows or aids in the absorption of calcium and therefore promotes bone development. Okay. Um, and then we mentioned iron as well. Iron deficiency is most prevalent among adolescent girls, and this is basically because the teenage girls lose some of the iron in their blood when they're menstruating, and when not compensated from dietary intake, iron deficiency can occur. Earlier, I mentioned the relationship between vitamin D and calcium, and therefore the need for calcium peaks during teen years because of um, bone development. Remember that calcium is an important part of the bone mineral matrix known as hydroxylapatite, and that earlier we mentioned that calcium is also dependent on vitamin D for absorption, right? So this is a crucial time for bone development and therefore need for calcium. You remember earlier the average intake among Filipino teenagers, both coming from the male and female groups in the population, calcium intake is not even 50% of the recommended. So this can pose a problem. So low intake common among teens, and this is basically what we just said. So um, among teens, food choices and eating habits may vary, but um, what factors that are common among teens and their food choices are basically influenced by the following: a busy lifestyle, which can result in irregular eating habits. Um, they tend to get busy with other things that they deem more important than eating, and therefore because this is the point where they're they're feeling more independent. They want to assert that independence from their parents and, as I've said earlier, from persons of authority. So it is the role of adults to serve as gatekeepers, and it's probably a little bit too late to if you wait until the kids are in their teen years. You have to start when they're younger. So habits must be carried now. It's a lot more difficult to start when they are already in their teens. You have to be able to start earlier than that. So similar to education starts at home, education for teens to select, no, to behave healthily um, in terms of food intake, we have to start at home, and therefore practicing good nutrition and good nutritional practices is critical, and they have to start at home. Okay, so that parents or adults in the home must be the responsible individual in this scenario. And for snacking, about one fourth of daily energy intake come from snacks from outside the home. And the tendency is that these snack items can, um, if not chosen very carefully, they tend to be more, um, they tend to be higher in calories or higher in sugar and fat, right? So most of them are also very salty and therefore high in sodium. So, but if chosen carefully, they can contribute to some needed nutrients. We mentioned that um, teenagers generally require higher amounts of energy intake per day. So snacking can be critical in this respect. Beverage consumption, the trend is that there is increased consumption of soft drinks and or the tendency to choose um, non-milk beverages, and that leads to perhaps risk to developing low bone densities, no? Especially during because it is during this critical period in time that bone development is critical, and if you do not provide enough calcium from the diet, bone density may be at risk, no, to softening. Um, what is called Malaysia or osteoporosis can develop earlier than you would expect. Regular soft drink consumption is linked to obesity as well because of the high energy content, including sugar. Caffeine is also a growing problem among teens. Um, they tend to drink from caffeinated drinks like tea or iced coffee. Seems to be a trend today. Like you're cool if you have um, an iced latte or americano in your hand going around campus, at least before COVID-19. So there can, but if you think about it, moderate intake of caffeine is relatively harmless, but the greater amount, so maybe around 3 or more cups, can result in symptoms similar to anxiety, as caffeine is actually um, it is a stimulant. No, it's a cardiac and renal stimulant, and so as a cardiac stimulant, some people have a tendency to become to have palpitations. So another thing about eating, another issue is about eating from home. Adolescents eat about one third of meals away from home, so this is very significant. About 33% of their food intake is outside of the home and therefore not regulated, not being looked after by responsible adults. So that maybe if you think about on the public health perspective, the nutritional welfare is enhanced or hindered by by their food choices. So it's very critical, perhaps, to mobilize our schools um, to advocate, no, for them to advocate more nutritionally sound policies, particularly with what they sell in the canteens, in the cafeteria. Another problem would be fast food chains. They tend to compete, no, but we can do something by encouraging our those in the food industry, particularly in the fast food industry, in fast food sector, to offer more nutritious choices, not just for teens but for everybody else. Peers are often significant influencers, so um, I don't know. I don't think parents can choose who their children, their teenagers, should go out with. But this is really hard. I'm not a parent myself, so perhaps one key here is to maybe invite um, their friends at home for some meal, for some snacks, for dinner perhaps, and then maybe parents can then teach the kids while they're at the table enjoying the meal. Adults can then also make nutritious foods available when they so that it can be a teachable moment. Now, for as a last topic, nutrition counseling, I'm not gonna we call this nutrition counseling because they have to be very specific in terms of they have to be individualized. And I mentioned earlier that contemporary lifestyles among teens are extremely varied, meaning to say some groups are very extreme with um, physical activity, while others are also on the opposite. They tend to be very um, inactive. Um, they don't move around that much as compared to the others. So that what this means is that really you have to be very specific as to gender, the particular age, if they belong to the early teens or the late teens. Um, are they physically active or not? Did they develop more muscle mass than fat mass? So that when you talk about these things for teens, among teens, um, they can understand why. Okay, but as I've said earlier, you have to start early. Okay, early, and um, but you have to understand where the teen is coming from. Okay, so think about whether the teen is ready for change before even attempting a family-based intervention. Also, parental role modeling is very critical. I cannot overemphasize this as education really begins at home, and if parents and other family members do not behave um, responsibly on food, no, then they may become negative role models, and that behavior can be copied by the teens, and they go out, they talk to their friends, they kind of do the same thing, and so therefore that can have a pervasive effect. So these are a few ideas on nutrition in adolescence. Thank you for your time.